Okay, good day. Welcome to another Straight Up Hangout weekly event presented by Barrel Strength Design and Pixel and Tonic. Today we have with us Matt Stein from Working Concept, Marian Newlevant, a freelancer, and Carlo Laitano, who's working with Vinveo these days, front-end developer and designer. All right, so today's topic is dry templating techniques. We're going to look at some code and see how we can make it a little more optimized and better. So first up, though, what is dry templating and why do we want it? We frequently build websites and they have last-minute deadlines, and we have great plans, and we might not have all the knowledge we need, and so we do things in these templates that we're building sites with, and it's not always the smartest thing or the best thing. And sometimes we inherit other people's projects, and we also see that there's a lot of code that doesn't need to be there. There's potential to reuse code and keeps things standardized. And we find that when there's a fine line we have to kind of evaluate as we code the front end of websites. We have to decide, can we benefit from reusing code and making it more standardized? We can reduce the number of errors, potentially improve efficiency of things, or sometimes we can take that too far and we can make things so abstract that everything is using the same big function, and it's really hard to figure out where anything is in the project. So we're going to start today kind of looking at some evolution of our templates and how we might start running into these scenarios, and then we'll see how far we can take it and discuss maybe when we start to cross that line of getting too dry for the time being. Anybody else want to say some initial thoughts on good practices as we approach our templates?
I would say it's about not repeating yourself, but it's also about having maintainable code, which means that if it makes it easier to understand, even if it doesn't make it shorter, that's a good thing.
Great.
Harder to mess up. I like to introduce human error into everything I do, and with really neat templates, it makes my job harder in a good way.
Yeah, that's that designing code against ourselves, or with ourselves in mind. All right, so let's dive into examples. I think that's an easier way to start discussing this. So I'm going to share my screen here and can take a look at what we have. All right, so I've got a very simple template, and it's a very conceptual template. Here's an index template. We've got our HTML head tag, body tag. We've got a few style sheets and a few script tags. The body we're testing to see if we have a class that we should associate with the body, and then we just have some content on the page. The page renders and says hello to us. All right, so what happens next? We get tasked with adding a second page to the website, and we might say, oh great, we're gonna copy our template. Most things are the same, and maybe this example is more appropriate with we have a class called page 1, and in that first one we have a class called home or something like that. And here we say we've got page 1 and so on. We get another page in the mix. We need yet another template, and soon we realize if we're a programmer or not, because this either starts to bother us greatly or not at all. So what do we do in this case? Is this a common scenario? Do we feel this happens? All right, so the first thing Twig starts letting us do to this is we can start saying, hey, there's stuff that's the same on every one of these templates. every one of them is really outputting the same thing with slightly different information. How about we try to standardize that information into a base template of some sort? And I've got a base template here that I created. We have a base HTML file, and we can take that initial code and put it in our base. And now we have to figure out how do we reuse this code in other places. So we might say, okay, the content can be reused. Oops. We add a block tag for our content. We might say our class doesn't always have to be here. We want to allow it to exist only if we want to define it. And we can output a variable with that class name in the body template. We might have, what other problems might we think about in this base template? So we might have some pages that have other CSS styles on them that we need to allow for. So maybe we have a extra header or something like that. We might have other script tags at the end of our file, so we could have extra footer content at the bottom that we allow a template to extend.
Would it be too soon to jump in with my favorite way of handling the scripts at the bottom of a page, where you wrap the entire script section in its own block, and you can call parent to call?
Yes, that's a good one. Let's do that. So actually, let's extend the template. I think it's a good one. Yeah. So let's extend the first template and compare how this connects, and then do that, because that's a great one. All right. So here we got our index file, which I seem to well, we no longer have the index file because I copied all the code to this base template file. But now this index file needs to extend our template file. So we can use Twig's extends tag, and we'll extend our dry folders layouts base file. And right now, let's reload our page and see what happens. We reload and we get an error because I made a mistake here. I didn't check if our body class variable is defined. What did I do here? Did I paste this twice?
Pasted kind of liberally.
All right. So here we get a blank page. If we look at the source of that page, it's not actually blank. It's actually got the structure of our file, but we're not outputting any content in the block tags yet or anywhere. So we can come back here, and now we can extend our block, our content, and we get to add back our h1 tag that says hello, and we're back to where we started. We have a page that says hello, and we've done it with 2 files now, and that's helpful to us because now we can start thinking about how are we extending these other pages, and we've got a much simpler template. We go back to our other page here, and we can update it, say hello 2 or hello 1, hello 2, and hello 3, and we've got much more reusable code. All right, so now let's start looking at those other content, other block tags where we started to talk about where other scenarios might exist. So the way I initially created this extra header, I created it in a way that if we have page 1 and page 1 has some extra CSS, we could add extra head and add some CSS tag to the page, page one, and when we render our template, this will get added at the bottom of the page. We got to kind of look at the source code to see this, or at the bottom of the section where it is. Now, that's helpful, but we've created another scenario here where if we start going through our page templates over here, and we have page 2, and it has as another thing, we start creating more block tags to extend the same thing. And that's okay if we have specific stuff, and then we can consider, I guess I'm rambling a little. There's a way we can make this more efficient, which Matt brought up, which is, well, what if we don't need this extra thing? What if we really only want to extend CSS classes? We don't want the option to put anything else there. We could have a block tag that goes right at the top called style sheets or whatever we want it to be called. Let's just call it CSS. And on our page 1 now, we could extend our CSS tag, but let's take a look at what our code does when I do that. It overwrites our original CSS and adds our new CSS. Now, if we don't want to lose that original CSS, we can do what Matt said and use a handy function called parent. And when we add a parent function there, we'll see that we get everything from our original block in the base layout, and we get our additional content from the template that we extended. Which way do folks generally do this? How many blocks do you allow to be overridden in a base template? Is there any things that I'm doing or missing here that you would speak to?
I like using the parent method only because like usually I'll have scripts at the bottom, I'll have just kind of like a general meta block at the top of the page. And I like using parent specifically because when that one-off case comes, you know, if it's a 404 page or something where you need to drop the scripts or do something really custom, you can completely wipe out like the normal includes or normal things you'd have on the page or completely change them. And that flexibility is really nice for odd cases where it becomes necessary.
Yeah.
I've never done that with the parent, but I think I need to start. One thing I do is that the block, end block, you can have the name of the block there and the end block as well. So you can say end block, CSS. Just tiny bit easier to keep track.
I believe you can also, this is more of just style points. I actually don't like the usage. I believe you can also just do block content hello or something like that, which it will still override the block. You don't get to put your, I mean, I guess you could put HTML in there or something too. It's not really good for longer content, but if you just had a block tag overriding a class or something like that, it's kind of a shorthand way to add a class name or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Which would be silly. It would still be better to set a variable, though, wouldn't it, than to use a block just for that? Or is that wrong?
Well, I think both have. Let's do an ID of a block and a class of a. So let's say body. What would this be? Block. Body ID.
body ID.
Yeah, I guess if you wanted to have that. And then, and let's maybe, I don't know, we don't have an ID by default, so maybe this is blank. Maybe it actually makes more sense to have the class as the, so the benefits of block versus the set variable. And when we see this type of syntax, if something is defined, output a variable, we're talking about setting something. So in order to add that to our template, we would need to add set set body class equal to something for class. So in this case, we could block body ID and then say one or something. So here we have two different ways to kind of do the same thing. The reason you might want to do one versus the other in general is block allows you to use this parent tag. So it allows you to override what's there or use what's there. Kind of gives you a fallback plan. With set, you're pretty much just adding something. You're overriding it directly. So if you had a scenario where you felt that you always wanted to have the ID of, you know, I don't know, something here, type of page, but then now and then you wanted an ID of a different type of page, you could kind of always have it fall back to block, whereas set here, we've got to either explicitly set it to get that variable, or we have to have some other sort of conditional here that make sure if it's not defined else, then display whatever you want as your class. One area I actually find this is important is in SEO metadata, choosing between block and set. Sometimes, depending on how nested your content is that you want to be using for your title or description tag, it's helpful to use a set tag instead of a block tag to get your metadata right. So when you extend a template with a block template, the order of processing changes. So depending on when you want your variable, the first thing that processes are these set tags on the page. The second tag is this extends tag, and the third is this block content. So if you need to be setting any metadata in your layout, you want to be doing it with set tags or somewhere outside of this your block content tag. Once you're outputting data in the block content tag, you no longer will be able to modify the other areas of your base template. You will be able to modify the block-specific areas of your template. All right, so let's dive into another example maybe. I think if we want to kind of push our comfort level, we're exploring these ideas and we want to push kind of our understanding of it. A great place to do that is the Craft Control Panel. They are using a lot of these techniques, and here we are. And I created a very basic plugin for this. Let's pull it up here. And in our plugin, I'm not going to go too much into the plugin, but we have templates in our plugin, and we have an index page in our template.
Plugin slayed me. That was great.
Plugin what?
The name of the plugin that got me. That was good. Nicely done.
Well, so here we are in our control panel now, and so one of the things that a plugin can do is if I just delete this content and reload the page, we'll see that our template in the plugin is really just like any other template on the internet that we create. It's a Twig file, and it can process Twig. So one of the first things we can do is extend Craft's layout, and immediately, well, our plugin throws an error because we don't have a title. So let me add that title in there. And I'll import some forms. We'll go into that a little bit later. But just by adding these 3 lines of code, now I'm completely in line with like the Craft Chrome, and I can kind of start creating settings and building out my settings, my settings or my control panel or my plugin. So Craft in its layout CP file, which is a lot more advanced than the example we were looking at, has several blocks and set variables that we can override. And we'll start by overriding the sidebar block and the content block, and that gives us some content on the page. Now, the parent template here is actually pretty advanced. If we don't need a sidebar, we can remove that. And if we wanted to have more or more focused UI, we can actually extend a different part of the layout, which is called main. And we'll see that the main block doesn't give us the nice white background. It kind of gives us this other layout, and this is the layout that we would use if we wanted to start building out kind of something like the entry form type of content where we have panes in the UI. So that if we extend our content block here, that's not how Craft generally extends that UI. We kind of get the wrong layout here. We could even go bigger if we wanted. I think there's a body block if you really just wanted to take over the whole page and ditch all of the Craft Chrome for some reason. There's another block, and so let's take a quick look at, and you never really extend the body block. It's mostly content or main that you'll be extending.
Hey, Ben.
Yeah.
Is there any way you would know this other than just kind of extending stuff and digging through? Like, is there any even informal documentation on roughly how this thing is set up?
No, that's a good question, and the answer is no. The best place for this is in your app directory in the templates folder. It's intuitive to get started. If you go to the index template, you'll find what's happening when you like if you can kind of look at the URL structure in Craft, and you'll find the users pages in the users folder and the entries pages in the entries folder. So you kind of have logical starting points if you want to start seeing what's happening, but it gets a lot more abstract a lot quicker too with some of what they're doing there. Let me see if I have the Craft templates folder open here. So we can see that we're extending layouts CP in our template, and that's located here in the templates folder under layouts CP. And we open that and we see that, well, it's actually extending yet another file called base CP, and it's doing a bunch of stuff. It's loading CSS resources and translations, and it's got various other things going on. So it takes a little parsing before you kind of find, like, I just want to be outputting data on the page. What am I supposed to be doing here? There's a lot of kind of overhead to get to that. But once you start understanding the basics, you start to be able to find them. And the cool thing here is we start to see block tags nested within one another. So when we overrode the block body and took over the whole page, well, that's Craft giving us a block tag to take over the whole page if needed. And if we keep scrolling down, we'll find our other somewhere. Here we go. Here we go. Craft is setting the variable main to the block main. If we have set block in our extended template, they create a variable from it called main, and then they do some conditional and say, if this extended plugin has a custom layout, use what they're giving us here, otherwise do this other stuff. And if we continue through this else statement, we'll see this is the else statement that says, okay, well, if they haven't overridden our whole layout, then we have the option to override a sidebar, add tabs to the page if you need to, or just override the content of the page. So we'll see, there's a lot of other scenarios that can be extended here, but if you're pushing your limits and interested in kind of becoming more, working on more advanced sites, the Craft control panel is a pretty good example of a pretty advanced use of extending layouts, template inheritance, and stuff like that. Any other thoughts, questions there? All right. Well, back to our simpler example then for the time being. So I wanted to then kind of start taking this into the next level of this. So we've got our here for this looking good. Gotta keep our code clean. Let's take this further. What if we wanted to start adding navigation to our site here? In our basic example, I'm going to make it global navigation, and I've got an unordered list that says here's the first place we might want to be, and here's the second place we might want to be, and see that we've got our nice little navigation there. So now what happens when we want to highlight that or do something like that? And I'm going to kind of create a very basic, dumb example here, but the one way we can do that is to start saying, okay, we want to add a class to our li tag that says active if our URL segment matches certain conditions. So I'm adding a if craft request get segment 2 is blank, then let's add class equals active, and then maybe for our second tag here we have if craft request segment 2 equals dry, then class equals active. And open the code view again here, and we see that our UL tag is not doing what I got the wrong segment here, segment 1. Okay, so when our URL first segment is dry, we have active, and then when it's not, oh, I guess I don't have a not condition because our home page doesn't. We're working in a subfolder here. So actually, let's go with segment. Let's do this page 1. We'll call this dry home. And that dry. or when segment 2 is blank, we get that, and then segment 2 is page 1, we get active. So there we get active on our page 1, and then if we go to our dry, we get active on our home. All right, so this is fun, but what's the new dry problem we have here kind of is there starts to become a lot of logic in our templates, and it gets harder to read our code and understand what's happening. So what can we do in this scenario? We can start to consider using macros for this. This will give us a way to kind of write functions in our templates that allow us to reuse code. And let me pull in a macro is, here's a simple starting place. And we would probably organize our code a little better than this. I'm kind of doing it all in similar files just because it's easier to compare things if we do that. So here's a macro. It is called active class. We can pass it two variables, a slug and a segment, and within it we do pretty much what we're doing down here. We're saying if a request equals something, if a request of a particular segment equals some particular slug, then add the word active, class active, to our tab.
And so it's probably fair to say that a macro is different from setting a variable or from a block because it's not immediately showing up on the page, but it's adding kind of like a function, like a templating function that you create. Is that a good way of putting it?
Yeah. It's not. Yeah, you're creating. It's actually almost more like an include, where you kind of have a. I don't know. It's actually very similar to an include sometimes. So maybe we can compare the two after this. It kind of gives us a way to perform some code in a repeated way.
It's definitely, I think of it as a function that has to return a string.
Right. Yeah, and it has to return a string. You can't return an object or something else from it. It has to return a string.
But it's purely template related. It's not one of those dirty functions that you might embed in PHP in like an expression engine template or something. It's still a relatively clean thing that spiritually belongs within Twig.
Yep. Yeah. And you can have fairly advanced macros, and at some point you might consider if a macro gets so advanced it might make sense to make it plug in with a variable that handles it all in PHP. A variable and a macro can behave in very similar ways as well. So it's one of many tools that allow us to reuse a segment of code. All right, so what do we do with our macro? We've created it. If it's on the same page that we want to use it, we have to import it using this self variable. So we say import self, and I'm just going to use the word macros here. And then we begin to, I'll start just typing up here. We can now use that macro by calling the macros variable that we imported it as, and then the name of the macro that we have created. And in our case here, we need to pass a slug and a segment. So in our first scenario, we're saying if the slug is blank, segment 2. And in our second scenario, we have if the slug is page 1, segment 2, and then now we can, since we're returning the words class active as a string from our macro, we can take this and replace our conditional statement with this shorter version that helps us do the same thing. And if I refresh this page, we'll see the results are similar to what we got the previous time, updating based on the URL that we're getting. So this is this is another way to kind of do the same thing. And you know, if you wanted to compare it to a variable, I actually gave this example because early on we found ourselves doing this a lot, or found myself doing this a lot, and created a macro and then ended up updating it to just be a plugin, which we have called Sprout Active, and it's pretty much just does what this macro is doing. It makes it a Twig filter instead of a macro, so you don't have to import it, and you would have the filter available by the same name. But the code is pretty much doing the same thing in PHP as we're seeing here. Now, it's worth noting with macros, as Marion said, they return strings. So you'll note up here that I added these little dashes to the tags. We can remove those. And if we run the same method here, we'll see that we get the same results, but our code looks messy now. And what those dashes do, because we're returning a string, this macro is returning everything that's space within it here. So if we wanted to remove that space, we could either kind of make this a big lump of, you know, hard to read code, or we could use a technique that Twig has. It's similar to the spaceless tag, or the same thing as the spaceless tag behind the scenes, probably. Adding a dash to the end of, to the side of the tag that you want to remove spaces from will help clean up that code and make it look nice.
My understanding of that dash, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that what it says is between this tag and a previous tag, whether it's a double bracket or a percent bracket, strip out all white space that's between that. So it's not like an HTML tag and that little dash, but specifically Twig tags. Anything between where you put the dash and the next tag, it'll strip the white space out. Is that? I think that's true.
Yeah. So it's if we had a another, I guess in the case here, it is a little hard. If maybe we put this output this on the page for a better example, and if we have ASDF space. Let's test our all right, so let's use this one. So here we're getting spaces between both sides of this, and maybe, are you saying HTML tag, Matt, like a P tag or something?
Yeah, well, I was just, my understanding is that specifically what the dash means is that it'll clear out white space between itself and the next Twig tag, so whether it's a double bracket or a percent bracket. Okay. I don't know if I'm making sense, though.
Yeah, I think my example's pretty lame, probably, as well here, that I'm trying to test with, so.
I just get really excited to go through and try to make the tabbing and the spacing like on the source code really clean.
Yeah, it's really, this can become an obsession if you're trying to output a JSON file or something with like everything spaced perfectly, or
that would be a functional reason. Mine's just a personal problem.
Metadata is another fun one. To get all of your meta tags lined up perfectly.
Yeah,
I probably spent tons of hours on that on our SEO plugin.
Is there a way to insert a tab with like a character or a trick or something that's not actually a tab within the Twig template? Or if you're a tab user? Does that make sense? Like I've run into that over and over with specifically with meta tags and this obsessive quest to line them up. And I wish there was sort of like in Sublime, there's the auto align, paste and auto align method, and I wish there was something like that.
I don't have an answer, Marion. I know in Sublime there's this convert indentation to tabs, which is handy in spaces. But that's all I.
I just don't look.
It's probably the healthier way to deal with it.
Minify your HTML to make it all look like you didn't miss anything.
That's right.
Code. It's no longer source code. I would make that segment have a default value of 2 in this case because
segment.
And the macro.
Oh, okay. So where do we add our default?
Segment 2 in the parameters right there.
Ooh, cool.
Segment equals 2?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, great. Yes. So here we're creating a default. So if I wanted to then come back and delete this from our code, we can assume that any time that we're not passing that second variable, that it's just going to look for the second segment, and that's good. That gets us even shorter.
Also, you should comment your code.
Yes.
Jeez, Ben.
Especially, it's helpful with macros. Yeah.
We're all into programming in Twig, and really, the most important part of programming is going to be the comments.
So let's discuss some other potential macros that we might want to use. Douglas says, just run the final HTML through a formatter using grunt. There you go, Matt. So,
but Twig is outputting the HTML.
Yeah, it's kind of going to slow down your server.
I mean, I could save it separately for my own mental health, but I don't know if that would benefit the site that much.
Well, we'll summarize and say there are build tools that might be able to reformat your code at a particular time in the process to your standards.
I see. So after Twig renders it, something could come sweep through and realign it, kind of.
But that's
a lot of effort.
Yeah.
Well, OCD is a lot of effort.
That's true. We stopped being concerned with misspent effort a while ago.
All right,
well,
let's.
Answering your request, right? It runs all the PHP and it does all that Twig and talks to the database and comes up with this messy-looking HTML, which it's all ready to send to the browser, and then it runs it through a pretty printer one time. It's like view source is the most important part of your site analytics, and I guess so.
I'm going to jump into an article here written by Jamie Pittock recently, where he gives several examples of macros he uses, and I think they're nice examples. So he's doing the same thing, kind of importing these macros to the page, and here's some examples. If you're getting into you're asking the question, where can I start, optimizing my code with this stuff? Because there's a lot of opportunities, but it's not always obvious where to start. So a great one I think he starts with is just formatting a date consistently throughout your site. If you know the date filter that you want to be using, but you can't always remember the funny characters associated with how you want to be outputting it, you can create a macro that you pass in a date, and it gives you back the date in the format you need, and all you need to remember is the name of your macro. He expands on that, kind of allowing for different formats. I'm just kind of looking at some of his. He has another one where he reuses the way he includes files in a layout. So in the example here we have includes that have very long names that he's simplified to just be using a macro, so he could be targeting them more specifically. I've found this handy as well for something like SVGs. Frequently, SVGs can be stored as a file in a folder on your system. They're just markup. But including them becomes a little laborious sometimes if you have a lot of SVGs on your site. So you can create a little macro that does something like this, where you're handling all the include logic and the file extension logic in the macro. Something, just kind of an example of one we wrote once. Macro SVG template, and it's doing the same thing here, pulling it in. All you have to do is pass the template name, and it's worrying about all the other stuff. And it just shortens your code, makes it cleaner, easier to read. I don't know. There's many other I had. Truncate here, he's chopping up text to be a certain length with a macro, maybe for summaries or standardizing where your metadata or something. Matt, Marion, any other macro examples we want to bring up?
I always use macros for image tags because they always get complicated.
Yeah, and Marion wrote a nice article on Straight Up Craft about macros and responsive images, which is worth taking a look at if you're dealing with responsive images.
Appropriate to use macros for an empty test. Like often things kind of like the body class that you used in your example, I'll want to see not just if something is defined, but if it's an empty string. Is that overkill for a macro? I mean, it's just adding kind of like a little string of logic into a template that's kind of ugly. And I never really have an awesome way of cleaning that up.
I think you wish that macro would return a Boolean, and it won't.
Yeah. So maybe that's like better plugin territory or Twig extension or something.
You know, we have a null coalescing operator now too, which gives us some, like if we're setting a variable that may or may not exist, something like the body class here. I actually have not. Next week's Hangout is on null coalescing operators because I've got to become more familiar with these. But I think it tests for is defined or is null. So rather than writing body class is defined or is not null or something, then do something else. The new operator kind of gives us an option to just say fallback, something like that. So cool. that might handle some of the scenarios you're talking about, Matt, but that probably won't work if you're trying to do that to objects or something where the variable is always going to exist but still might not have the value that you want.
So the best thing in that case is probably a Twig extension?
I don't know.
It depends.
Yeah, I think, I don't know. I think if you could handle it with simple Twig logic or creative, like something like the null coalescing operator or the ternary type logic is sometimes a simple way that's supported out of the box to do, save some if-else kind of code. But what you're describing could very well be like you're dealing with more conditions than those constructs allow. So yeah, you could wrap it up and just have a nice well-named macro in your code instead of 4 lines of if-else logic that's hard to parse when you look at your code a week later.
It sounds like you're saying tune in next week.
We'll be talking a lot about conditionals and null values next week. All right. So here's another question for the philosophical. This was asked, Carl CS asked me this the other week, and I don't know the answer. He asked, what is the difference between a macro and a template using with only? So if we wanted to include, so I guess maybe this gets into the next part of this that I wanted to, is kind of another topic of how do we improve code? Well, we can start using some includes. So I've got another example here of an include. Let me find that real quick. All right, so here's our include. We have a page. Let's just start with this. We have a page. It has, we're setting a button label and we're including a file called callout, and in that callout we're outputting a button with the name of the thing that we added. And it gives us this do it button. Great. So we might have a button in several locations on our site, and we just want it to be the same button all the time, so we use an include, or we use a macro. So we have options. So one of the things you can do with an include statement is add a with parameter and pass variables to that include. So in our example here, we're taking, maybe I could break this out to show something. We're including, and then we're passing a variable called size, and then depending on if that size variable exists, we're either using it or we're just falling back to medium. So if we pass in large, our button gets bigger. If we pass in small, our button gets smaller. So another thing you can do here is add the word only. So by default, your include has access to all of the variables higher on the page. But if you add this word only, it only has access to the variables that you hand off to it. So if I resave that and reload my page, I all of a sudden get a template error because I'm trying to output the button label without testing if it exists. And it doesn't exist because our include template has limited what it has access to only to the variables being passed to it. So we could remove only, or we could do something like add our button label to get our page reloading again, or we could update this to, if we have our error here again, update this to do something like we are doing with the size and add a conditional that says, gives ourselves a default value if that isn't defined. So here's the question. What is different about this include using this only compared to a macro where we would call a method and pass it variables, and those variables have to be passed to the macro in order to work?
Do you want an opinion?
That's all I got.
Okay. I would, in this case, I would go with the macro because it's more self-documenting. Like there in the macro, it tells you exactly what the parameters are, particularly because you can have defaults, and you don't need to kind of read through the, here we're striking noon. You don't need to read through the whole of the template in order to figure out that, oh, I better have button labels set. Because, you know, you need to have button labels set, but it's not documented anywhere. Also, you can stick a bunch of macros in one file, and so you end up with less proliferation of files. I would be using an include, particularly if the thing with a macro is you have to know which macro you're going to call at compile time, and the thing with the include is that here you're just including dry underbar partials call out, but you could be including dry underbar partials and then constructing that string at runtime.
Yeah, those are good points. So if we updated this code to use a macro, we can see right away that our code is more readable. We know what we're calling before we have to parse through all of the different template information, and we do have to know which parameters our macro accepts, but that's something we always need to
figure that out by looking at the macro. A macro basically gives you less rope, and you always want to have as little rope as you can manage with.
Right.
Wow, that's way better than my speculative opinion was simply macros would have to be more efficient, because it seems like only is a convenience thing, and macros are just much leaner. But
it all gets compiled down into PHP, and I doubt there's any realistic difference in efficiency.
That's why I'd go with your answer, Mary.
Rope.
All right, so here's another use of includes that we run into, and I think this is more of a subjective. All of these are subjective to a certain degree, but let's take our Happy Logger site, and here we have an entry from our news section. This entry has a bunch of content from its matrix field, some body content, a quote, and so on. I'm missing an image. So let me pull up the code for this. Here's our article code, and we'll see this template is, I don't know, 150 lines long, and it's doing a handful of things, and then down here at line 65 we start to loop through our block types, or look at our block types and determine which we're outputting. And I guess type is set farther up the page. Yeah, so here they're doing a little bit of logic to determine which type as they walk through each block, and farther down the page we kind of get this switch conditional of if it's a particular type, this is what we do. So a common use of one thing we can do here is kind of break it. So maybe this is great. Maybe we don't have many blocks. Maybe the code within each block is pretty simple, and we're okay with having this all in one template. Or maybe we have a matrix that's 20 blocks large, and when we start writing conditionals for each of the 20 blocks, it gets really unwieldy about what we're doing in this template. So one way that we can start to break this out is with an include. And we could say include, and have this in my dry. We can blocks. I have a folder called dry partial blocks, and then within that blocks folder, I have a bunch of files named the same thing as the block in question. So we're just going to pass the variable type to this. So in the case of news section, this is going to become news section block. In the case of heading, it's going to become heading block. And actually, news section, I haven't looked too closely at this code. I'm not sure these are all blocks. This might be some logic that they're dealing with. But let's assume they're all blocks for now. Pull quote block. So we can go to our folder now and look in our templates, blocks, and we can start considering. I don't have these created yet. Let's say we have a new section block, and let's say we have a heading block, text block, and a pull quote block.
This is an excellent example of why you would want to be passing not just a string, but an array of strings.
An array of
So you would include.
Array of strings.
Yeah, so you would pass dry underbar partials blocks tilde type, an array consisting of that, and dry underbar partials blocks / default.
Yes. Okay, yeah, let's look at that last. Let's look at that last. Or let's add that after we get to connect this. So now what we can start doing is taking the code from each of these sections. We added new section to our area. A file, we can add that there. We've added heading to our file. We can add that there. We've added text to our file. And we'll see some of these are pretty lame, like you have a text template with a single output tag. But what we start to see happening is that our template becomes a lot more clean. And if you have blocks with more advanced stuff in them, like say this image block, we start to be able to get all of this code out of this primary template into a secondary template that's just focused on doing one thing well. I'll go the whole way here. We've got gallery and quote left. And all right, so now we've got all of these things broken out, and we're just going to delete this whole switch statement. So we've removed a lot of lines of code. Our template is now 95 lines long. We have several more templates to manage, so this is a structural decision that's making things a little bit more abstract, so we have to be on board with that. But when we reload the page, see if that works, we get the same content back. And everything's working as we expect it to be. All right, so then Marion was bringing up a good point here. So what happens if we added a new block in the control panel and it wasn't part of this? Well, it would look for a template and it wouldn't find one, and that's fine. I don't think it'd throw an error.
It would throw an error.
It doesn't throw an error if you're just loading an incorrect template. I don't.
I think it does.
Oh yeah, it does. Okay, so you can't have a
error.
Yeah, so this works towards your example here, Marianne. So what happens if you add something that doesn't exist? Well, our include tag actually accepts an array of paths, so we can update this first to just be an array. So we've now made our string variable that we're passing to include an array. If we reload that, everything's still working as we expect. But what this allows us to do is actually break this out and start adding additional UR or paths if we need to. So we could have a default block, like Marion was describing, where if our block is not found, we fall back to some block default that we've created that tries to handle any generic scenario that could occur. Marion, how do you generally handle the default? How do you plan for the default?
My default block would probably just say, you haven't yet implemented this type.
Yeah.
So it's just slightly makes me feel better than getting that error.
Yeah.
Photo of a cat, I think.
There you go.
Great. Great. So yeah, this is a powerful tool, and there's a presentation slides out there by Anthony Coangelo, I believe.
Yes.
and he goes into examples of this using this type of structure for summary content and body content and maybe heading content. So the way,
type.
yeah, you can. Yeah, you could do this at the entry type level as well, not just the matrix block level. So you could kind of say every entry type gets passed off to its own template file, and then within that, every matrix block gets passed off to its own template file. And if either doesn't exist, it falls back to a default type. One of the cool things I thought that Anthony was doing is they basically treated all their entry types. The default was actually something that assumed that there was a title. So it assumed entry title existed. So the default kind of was able to, the default entry type, for example, if it didn't know what fields existed on a more specific entry type, it would just kind of fall back to doing something with the title, which works if you have, say, search results or something like that, and you want different types of content displaying differently in the search results, but some types of content, you don't have a particular way you want to handle them, so you just kind of default to using a title and maybe a standard summary or overview field that you create as part of all of your content.
You can do that same thing with the array of strings on the extends as well.
Oh, really?
Uh-huh.
So that's, I gotta find another template to think about that. So what is a scenario, Marion, where, so here we have our basic layout that we looked at before. We're extending our base, so we can extend an array here, you're saying?
Yeah. Now you're going to ask me when I would actually do that.
Yeah, now I'm going to ask that.
That would be when your layout was maybe constructed off of your entry type. Say if you had a different layout for each entry type.
Oh, interesting.
And then you know, you could have a default layout for if you didn't have a specific one for that entry type.
So here we might have base and our entry type. And no, so this would try for that a more specific entry type layout, and if it didn't exist, fall back to a base layout. And note that just before, when we tried to include a URL that didn't exist, it threw an error. But now that we have this cascade, if this doesn't exist, it's not going to throw an error. It's going to go on to the second one, and if that one exists, you'll be fine. Oh, so entry doesn't exist. Great. So you get hit anyway. So here we go. This doesn't exist as a template, but we're not seeing an error on our page. But if we did have it dynamic, the same would be true. Cool.
I have a hypothetical question for both of you. So say I've embraced dry templating, right? And I now have a matrix block, and I'm dynamically including a different template to show that matrix block. I'm working locally, and when I make my changes within this new dynamically included template, they're not reflected on the page. And I figured out from brute force that I have to go into Craft's runtime storage and delete the compiled templates folder to see my update. How can I do that better? Or what am I doing? Does this happen to anybody but me or my friend? Doesn't happen to me. I always know what I'm doing. But has this happened to you guys, where you've included a template and it's included down the chain enough that once it gets compiled, when you make updates to it, if you refresh a page on the front end, it doesn't reflect the template change until you've cleared the compiled templates? And we're in development mode and everything. But,
yeah, I haven't run into that too much.
Not so much lately.
But yeah, I'm not the best to know how that Twig template cache works either. It would be good if we could ask that to somebody smarter than me. If anybody out there in the audience knows, feel free to post a comment. Marion, did you have more insight?
No, I have a recollection of tripping over that, but not recently. That's all I can offer.
Yeah, I can relate to it too, Matt, in that sometimes like Twig seems to cache something that it otherwise didn't cache most of the time, and I don't really know when those scenarios get triggered.
Certainly when I'm thoroughly baffled, that's one of the things I do is delete that template cache and clear all the other caches, and then at some point later I'm no longer thoroughly baffled, but whether that was what fixed it, I don't know.
I treat it like parking tickets. I just pay it as quickly as possible and like forget about it, never speak about it again.
I've worked with a few embedded templates. I mean, I spend most of my time thoroughly baffled, but I've spent a while with a current site where they're dynamic includes, and just every time I edit the template at the end of the chain, I have to go and clear the compiled templates in the runtime folder.
Chase mentions that it might be OP cache related, or maybe some other caching setting.
Maybe something else in there.
Yeah, we'll have to get some cache folks on the line someday.
There might be some config variable that you could set to make it less like that. I don't know.
That's what I was thinking. Because, I mean, I'm in development mode. I'm presumably going about it halfway intelligently. But it distinctly clearing that compiled templates folder fixes it every time.
Have you tried a Windows machine or something? So Douglas McDonald says that the extends example that we're talking about here could be helpful in situations where you have templates for different localizations. So another use case that might come in handy. All right, well then, do we have any other thoughts on includes here? I think sometimes they're really helpful to simplify the code on our page, and we can use them dynamically.
I want to recommend the with and the only in the theory of giving yourself less rope.
Oh, you mean be specific in your, don't leave too many variable options open as you as you become drier.
Right. Well, it's sort of about more maintainable, I think, than necessarily drier.
More maintainable.
You know, if you get too much rope, you hang yourself.
I also feel that when you give too much rope, you usually don't know what you're doing as much. I think it's actually when we inherit projects or see code, there's some people that are just kind of programmers by nature that love to abstract things farther and farther, and then I think there's some people that don't know what they're doing. I say that respectfully. We're all in that camp a lot. And you cast your net wider because you're afraid that if you make it more specific, you're going to create a scenario where it bites you. And I think it's a really good test for yourself, actually, to try to be more specific, because it proves that you understand the concept that you're using more. And at a certain level, you know, if you throw an error, you'll understand that problem that you thought you had added a very specific answer to successfully. You'll understand that you didn't understand it entirely, and kind of be able to expand your solution to fit it better. I find that's kind of one of the principles I see in code that I think has a lot of room for improvement that we inherit or are looking at. It's people who are afraid to delete things because they're they're just afraid, like, I did it once, I'll never do it again if I delete it, and just delete it. If you can't do it again, you know, you gotta, yeah, it's like once you're comfortable with a concept, doing it again is almost quicker than uncommenting and refactoring a small thing that you were afraid to delete in the first place. All right, a couple of folks are saying the video feed has halted. We have no control over that, so we wish you the best, and we'll hope it's still recording for you in the future here. Do folks have time for one more example? I pulled together an example on embeds, which I'm a little scared to try to share because I'm scared of embeds. Shall we look at it?
Sure.
All right. So, anybody want to explain what an embed is?
Like a cross between an extend and an include.
So it allows us to include another file while also giving us the option to use things like block tags which override content in that other file. And I've struggled to understand these for a while, and also just haven't really had use cases where it seemed very necessary. So I'm not finding. But it and the few times I have seen them, I kind of sometimes feel like it's just doing something in a fancier way than it needs to be done. But let's take a look at one use case. Carl CS actually pointed me towards an article that that was pretty helpful on this. I'll add it to the show notes. But it gave the use case of a theme and having different layout templates and using extends kind of as a way to have more control over which theme and which layout you're using. So let's start, and this is very similar to the concepts we've been going over. We're starting with template inheritance. We're going to start extending our base template, except we're just going to do it a little bit more than usual. We're going to extend it once, and we're going to extend it again, and then we're going to include something kind of at the end of the path. So here we have a base template similar to what we had before, and this is the example from the article I'll post a link to. And it has a block for a class that might represent the theme style for the styles, and it has a block for the layout. So we don't have a block for the content yet. This base file has a block for the layout. So next file in the thread is this theme shopping, and it really only has one use in this example. It's extending that base, and then it's updating the block class, the theme class that we created, and calling it our shopping template or our shopping theme. So here you're seeing all that's changing is the class in the parent, and it's extending the parent. And then we have one more level, which is the layout, or no, actually the layout's last. Well, the layout's kind of next. But let's let's go to the layout next. So then the thing we're trying to solve here, I think, is we have a site that might have multiple themes on it. It might have a shopping section and a content section or whatever, or maybe we're just trying to create something that's reusable for multiple projects. This theme has a shopping, but this shopping section has more than just style differerences. It also has layout differences. It might have a 9:3 layout and a 6:6 layout and a whatever other layouts that we might have in the page grid. So we have a layout template that's representative of the layout that we want to, the base layout that we have. The body content is wrapped. It has a 9-column content area and a 3-column sidebar area. And now we want that to be generic. We want to be able to use that on several different pages. And then now we have a page. So this is where everything comes together. Our page is extending our shopping theme. So this is the second extended template. We're extending the shopping theme. That's extending the base template. And then we're overriding that layout block from the base template. But then we're kind of we're then including the layout template to be the thing that we're actually overriding when it comes to the block tags within it. So we're then including our layout template, which we just saw, and then within this embed tag, we're able to override the content and the sidebar that are defined here in the layout. And something doesn't load properly. Totally worked before. What am I doing wrong?
Extending embed / template, and these are all actually in the embed folder.
Yeah, that should be right. The embed folder.
Yeah, so no index template.
So yes, that's it. Marion, page. There we go. I wasn't loading anything. Simple. So here we can see the output. We've got our body template. The class on that base HTML template's been updated to shopping from our theme. Our layout is here, our wrapper with our 2 columns, and then our content has been overridden by what we have on our particular page.
That's a lovely example. It's sort of like instead of, if you just had a regular layout template you were extending, then it would have to define all the content blocks. And this way, you're defining some of the content blocks in, like the theme one here, and the layout, the embed layout thing is defining its own content blocks. So you could have a different layout that didn't even have a content and sidebar.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the first time I've kind of seen an embedding and said, okay, I get it. And it was from this article here by Hugo Girardel, dealing with themes and layouts with Twig. And he goes through kind of a little bit more around that example and some of the alternatives that you know the less great ways to approach the problem.
I think that's what the example in the Twig documentation is trying to explain, but I never could understand it. It was too abstract. Does the control panel Twig use any embeds?
I don't know. Let's take a look.
String search.
Why did I not? Yeah, not finding any.
Okay.
Thought I saw one in there once, but I don't recall.
Maybe they thought better of it.
It's one of those scenarios where, yeah, it's just trying to find a way to use it. Yeah, I mean, this could potentially be something used by the control panel for, say, the entry layout with the sidebar content and the main body content, and then your index page layouts, or you know, there's potentially some support for embeds that could be added there. I imagine it would be a bit of a refactoring job at this point, and I'm not sure. I think I'd have to think a little bit longer about you know, if you're setting variables, where are they available here? Does this add one more layer of abstraction for what's available with where you're setting it and whatnot? I don't know. All right, well, please don't ask any questions. I don't know anything more than that about embeds. But hopefully we start seeing them used.
I wanted to go back to macros.
Okay.
Yeah, find out that you can have a macro that calls another macro.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah, and you do this in your responsive image example, don't you?
I do it. I do it all the time, actually. And you can have a macro that calls itself. You can have a recursive macro. So
nice. Got to be careful, cool. But yeah.
Session level stuff.
Oh yeah, it can break in all the usual ways, but it's useful in the usual ways too.
Nice.
Sometimes for when the nav tag, when you're struggling with the craft nav tag because it's not doing what you want it to, sometimes just a recursive macro will just do exactly what you want, and you know, it's all tucked away there in the macro in some macro file, and so you're not faced with that complexity most of the time.
So where maybe we go on. Or,
that's it.
Okay.
Just they exist. You'll know when you need them.
I guess let's maybe end with the question of where do we start drawing the line? When does reusable code go too far? And I guess it would have been helpful to have an example.
Isn't the answer kind of subjective? It's like my quest for tabbing markup, you know, making sure the tabs all line up. It's once you've put so much time into it, that's just not worth what you're getting out of it. Or is there an actual good answer to that question?
No, I don't have I think my kind of read is if I find myself looking for something for too long, like I begin to wonder, like, is this really need to be this efficient? Like, it's taken me, you know, 5 minutes to even locate it in the file structure. Like, there's got to be a better way that it would have been more intuitive in some way. So I don't have a list of things I really look for. It's more of it just feels wrong if you can't find anything or something.
I think if it makes your code harder to understand, then you've gone too far.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's an area that I see this happening. If you kind of go down this path of you abstract, have that file open at like 1,000. Our include example. So in our article body here, you know, we've included this. We're falling back to a default. And if this was within an entry type, well, we might be including an entry type and falling back to a default. And then if we're reusing similar matrix field or other fields between entries and categories, then we could actually have if it's an entry, go to this, if it's a category, go to this, and go to default. And then you've almost got to the point where you've abstracted everything into one, like, it hits the index page, it determines if it's an index or a category, it passes it off to whether it's an entry type of this type or that type or the other, then it passes it off to whether it's a matrix field. And I find that, like, direction interesting. I think it makes for a lot of reusable code, but it also kind of reaches a point that if your naming conventions or your file structure aren't rock solid, you've created it. You really need to train whoever's getting up to speed on it, or you could kind of throw a lot of people for a loop who aren't expecting that level of abstraction when they enter your website folder.
I always know I've gone too far when I come back 6 months later and I go, oh my God, this is way too complicated.
All right. Well then, let's wrap up on that. And sound good? Are we good to
Sounds
wrap
good.
up? All right.
Question marks next week.
Question marks, double question marks. The Twig's null coalescing operator. We'll go
Yeah,
into some exploration of that.
yeah. And if you get bored with that, you can go on to the binary operator.
Yeah. We'll compare the null coalescing operator to some of its alternatives and stuff like that. I think the best way to get an understanding is start comparing it to what we already know and where it works or doesn't work. So, all right. Yes. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. This event will be posted live within a few hours, and we'll see you next week. It's been a straight-up hangout. We're here weekly.
Thanks, Ben.